Welcome to Grace Fellowship Baptist Church Wednesday evening Bible study for Wednesday, September 18th, 2024. We are in the book of 2 Kings, chapter 17. In the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hosea, son of Elah, became king of Israel in Samaria, and he reigned 9 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, but not like the kings of Israel who preceded him. This is the most positive statement we've ever had for any king of Israel. They didn't mention that he followed the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat. He was just a bad king. But he didn't worship at the golden bulls. So in one sense, this is the best king of Israel. I can't say that's a great statement. That's a very low bar. To kind of get to the end of the story, he's also the last king. He is named after the man that brought the Israelites into the promised land. Hosea was the name of Joshua before Moses made him his personal servant. And then Moses changed Hosea's name to Joshua. And in Hebrew, it's just a small inflection change that puts more meaning on the name. That he was named after the original name of Joshua is, he's still named after him. By the way, the minor prophet by the same name is also named after Joshua. So, he's the best of a bad bunch. He's not a good king. He does really stupid things, which we'll find out in the next few verses. Verse 3. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up to attack Hosea, who had been Shalmaneser's vassal and had paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria discovered that Hosea was a traitor, for he had sent envoys to So, king of Egypt, and he no longer paid tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore, Shalmaneser seized him and put him in prison. The king of Assyria invaded the entire land, marched against Samaria, and laid siege to it for 3 years. In the 9th year of Hosea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and deported the Israelites to Assyria. He settled them in Halah, in Gozan, on the Habor River, and in the towns of the Medes. Let's just kind of pause there for a minute. Hosea only ruled 9 years because he got conquered by the Assyrians and arrested, and the writers don't know what happened to him. I almost guarantee the Assyrians took him back to Nineveh and did their standard practice of peeled his skin off while he was still alive in public and let him die of exposure with no skin on his body. That is the kind of people the Assyrians were, that when they had a vassal king that rebelled and refused to pay tribute and they conquered the land, that's what they did to them. And when the archaeologists have done excavations in Nineveh, they have frescoes and bas-relief on the wall of them doing that. They were proud of it. They put it on 20-foot high walls, more than life size. They displayed their vileness in their capital and were proud of it. The Assyrians were not nice people. and they found in Hosea that he had been dishonest with them. And he had tried to make an alliance with Egypt so that he could quit paying tribute to the Assyrians, and the Assyrians could... The problem is the Egyptians are not particularly strong right now. They're at one of the low points in their history. They're not able to fend off the Assyrians. They probably don't want to make an alliance with him. They probably want to keep the Assyrians as far from their border as possible, because they might be able to defend their own land, but they don't want to have to defend their land against the Assyrians. And they're better off if they don't. They want a bunch of small little vassal states between here and there and keep the Assyrians from coming through, and let those lands get depleted and then conquered. And it takes years to do each little city state and each little country, and some of them are pretty warlike, like the Philistines, and they have the idea that Judah and Israel are also that way. Edom and Moab are not hospitable countries either. And so they're kind of hoping that the Assyrians wipe themselves out trying to get through Palestine before they get to Egypt. It's not in their interest to have a vassal state in Palestine. And how did the king of Assyria find out he sent envoys to Egypt? The easiest explanation is the Egyptians sent him a message and says, hey, go check your accounts with Israel. He sent envoys to us to have us back him up. We're not going to. We want peace with you. And that's probably what they did. That was what was in their best political interest, to keep as much peace with Assyria as possible, and tell him about traitors, and let him take care of his own problems, and that way the Assyrians can go deal with easier to conquer peoples instead of try to conquer Egypt, which would be hard for them to go down to and conquer, and hard for them to control. And the Assyrians do come in and conquer Israel. And there's several things to note there. He took all the people out of the land and he settled them in different places. And one of those places that he settled them is among the Medes. It's going to be a few generations later that the Medes conquer the Babylonians. The Medes at this point are at their low point. They're going to come out of the Assyrian captivity with the goal of conquering the world, making a Medish empire. And they're not going to succeed on their own. They're going to ally themselves with the Persians, who also came out of the Assyrian captivity with the goal of conquering the world. The Babylonians were the first ones to leave the Assyrian Empire, and they also had the idea to conquer the world. And in 4 generations, they went from a captured people to a great empire. That was unheard of in that day and time. Normally, it was 4 or 5 generations to get the country built up to the point it could start thinking about conquering the world, and then 4 or 5 generations or more conquering the world, 2 or 3 holding it, 4 or 5 of it slowly shrinking. That was the typical empire pattern that had been there up to this time. And that whole dynasties spent their whole time expanding the kingdom till they collapsed at the end. And many, many generations. And the Assyrians had used that model. In case you haven't noticed, almost every time they attack Israel, it's a different king of Assyria. And this is intergenerational. This is the same family. This is the grandfather, the father, the son, the grandson, the great-grandson, very often, coming in and doing this. And they have records. They know what granddad said and what treaties he had, because they were in the court listening. They knew what dad said because they were a minister in his court when he made it. And they're going to enforce those contracts, those social contracts that had been made. And, you know, I've said before, the mode of operation of the Syrians is they came in and conquered a land and made the king a vassal king so he could keep his kingdom, and demanded tribute, and they impoverished the land with the level of tribute they extracted, and then when the king rebelled, and inevitably he rebelled, he, his son, his grandson, somebody, because the land was impoverished. They couldn't pay it anymore. And what do you do when you can't pay it? You're desperate. You can't even pay your own army. Of course, that was part of what the Assyrians meant, is to impoverish the land and get it to where they couldn't field an army, and then they go in and conquer it, wipe the people out, take the few that are out left, and spread them out somewhere else and mix them in with other people and move new people in that they'd had from conquered lands. And that way they expand their empire, and they're not conquering the Israelites per se. They're defeating the Israelite God, and they're dispersing those people throughout their kingdom so they no longer are Israelites. The Medes, the Persians, and the Babylonians were some of the few people that maintained their identity under the Medes, under the Assyrians. And I don't know totally why. I think the Babylonians, they developed the Babylonian identity during the Assyrian rule. And notice some of the Israelites went to Babylon. But most of them went to the Medes. And that's very interesting, because the Babylonians become ascendant. They refuse to be as vile as the Assyrians. They give people religious rights. The Assyrians had not. They then rule actually with a very just political system, and spread the idea you can have good governance and fair governance and treat minorities with respect. And that became the norm. Everybody that had had any dealings with the Assyrians refused to be like the Assyrians. And so when the Medes and the Persians paired up to meet their mutual interest in conquering the world and conquering the Babylonians, they continued a lot of those same policies. And the Medes, the first king of the Medes that ruled the Medo-Persian Empire, Darius the Great, is the one that let the Jews go back to Jerusalem. he's only 5 generations away from the Israelites being taken into captivity and put in with the Medes. The Israelites intermarried with the Medes. The Medes, by the time of the Medo-Persian Empire, are partially Jewish. They've lost their, not partially Jewish, partially Israelite. They have lost their Israelite identity. But many of the ethics and the values that the Israelites had, that God had instilled in them, became part of Mede culture. And when they're refusing to be like the Assyrians, and they're giving religious rights just like the Babylonians did, and they're ruling with justice and righteousness like the Babylonians did, but they're going to do it one step better, because that's part of what they promised. Part of what they do is let the Jews go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, and they pay for the temple to be rebuilt. God was working that out here. He was punishing his people for rebelling against him, but he was also putting into place an ethical people that would honor the people that still honored him. This is history in working. God is working in history. He's not forgotten his promises. He's not forgotten the curses. He knows where he's going. He knows that in the fullness of time, he's going to send his only begotten Son to dwell among human beings and die as an atoning sacrifice, the Lamb of God. He's preparing that even in the Assyrian captivity. The Assyrians may have thought they were just spreading people around at random. God was using them to make it happen the way he wants to have it happen in a few years. Verse 7. All this took place because the Israelites had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of Egypt, from under the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. They worshipped other gods and followed the practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before them, as well as the practices that the kings of Israel had introduced. The Israelites secretly did things against the Lord their God that were not right. From watchtower to fortified city, they built themselves high places in all their towns. They set up sacred stones and Asherah poles in every high hill and under every spreading tree. At every high place they burned incense, as the nations whom the Lord had driven out before them had done. They did wicked things that provoked the Lord to anger. They worshipped idols, though the Lord had said, "You shall not do this." The Lord warned Israel and Judah through all his prophets and seers, "Turn from your evil ways, observe my commands and decrees in accordance with the entire law that I commanded your fathers to obey, that I delivered to you through my servants the prophets." But they would not listen and were as stiff-necked as their fathers, who did not trust in the Lord their God. They rejected his decrees and the covenant he had made with their fathers and the warnings he had given them. They followed worthless idols, and they themselves became worthless. They imitated the nations around them, although the Lord had ordered them, "Do not do as they do," and they did the things the Lord had forbidden them to do. They forsook all the commands of the Lord their God and made for themselves 2 idols cast in the shape of calves and an Asherah pole. They bowed down to all the starry host, and they worshipped Baal. They sacrificed their sons and daughters in the fire. They practiced divination and sorcery and sold themselves to do evil in the eyes of the Lord, provoking him to anger. So the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them from his presence. Only the tribe of Judah was left, and even Judah did not keep the commands of the Lord their God. They followed the practices Israel had introduced. Therefore the Lord rejected all the people of Israel. He afflicted them and gave them into the hands of plunderers till he thrust them from his presence. And if that sounds like a legal indictment, it is. The prophet that wrote this was writing a legal document indicting God's people for their disobedience to God. And he recorded it and states it in the form that God did the justice he said he would do through Moses, through other prophets, and brought it to pass. And he gives detailed accounting. This is the most accurate accounting we have for all the vile practices they did. And they worshipped the other gods. And they mention the practices, but not the names of the gods. And they mention all the things, the building up high places everywhere to worship at, instead of going to one central temple. And who knows what they were doing there. Every high place would have had a different practice, and there might have been some commonality across them all, but they would not have been following the Mosaic law. Even if temporarily somebody did, start worshiping Yahweh and therefore clear out all the idols and the cult stuff from their high place and worship Yahweh there, according to Mosaic law, they would, a generation or two later, this grandson or the great-grandson or whatever would come back in and go, hey, this religion seems more interesting. Let's do it instead. And the people were not faithful and had not been diligent to teach their children and exclude those who did not obey. And so they did all the sordid practices and broke all the 10 Commandments and did everything God told them not to do. And God was very angry with them. That, by the way, is the second time in Scripture that the very emphatic Hithiel tense is used. The other one is at creation, where God looked at everything he had made, and behold, it was very good. Here he's very angry. He's completely and totally angry. He's not just a little bit torqued. He's not just a little perturbed. He means to wipe them out. Except he still has a place in history. And he doesn't kill every one of them. He shapes history so it will come about the way he wants it to come about. And they're going to be part of that history, even if they're not worshiping him. If they're off in foreign lands doing foreign things. Even if they have to worship the Assyrian gods for a generation or two until they're sick and tired of worshiping those gods. And then they worship other gods. Verse 21. When he tore Israel away from the house of David, they made Jeroboam, son of Nebat, their king. Jeroboam enticed Israel away from following the Lord and caused them to commit a great sin. The Israelites persisted in all the sins of Jeroboam and did not turn away from them until the Lord removed them from his presence, as he had warned through all his servants the prophets. So the people of Israel were taken away from their homeland into exile in Assyria, and they are still there. At the time of this writing, which we're going to see is at least 2 generations from this event, because of what's said later in the chapter, they're still in captivity in the lands where the Assyrians took them. They did not ever get to come back home. God did not redeem the northern kingdom. It was irredeemable. The Jews knew where they were, knew what they were doing, and knew they were still rebelling against God and that God wasn't fixing to bring them back. Verse 24. The king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, Sepharvaim, and settled them in the towns of Samaria to replace the Israelites. They took over Samaria and lived in its towns. When they first lived there, they did not worship the Lord, so he sent lions among them, and they killed some of the people. It was reported to the king of Assyria, the people you deported and resettled in the towns of Samaria do not know what the God of that country requires. He has sent lions among them, which are killing them off, because the people do not know what he requires. Then the king of Assyria gave this order: have one of the priests you took captive from Samaria go back to live there and teach the people what the God of the land requires. So one of the priests who had been exiled from Samaria came to live in Bethel and taught them how to worship the Lord. The Assyrian concept is, our gods defeated your gods, that's why our people defeated your people. That's why you're living in captivity, and it's natural order for you to be our slaves. And that's the way they told us. And they moved new slave peoples in, and they moved them from all over the place so that they didn't have one national identity. And lions were attacking and killing people. And it was reported back to the king of Assyria, and he had a problem on his hand. That god seems to still be active. We thought we'd killed him. Well, okay. One priest can go back and teach the people what they need to do. And this is how much polytheistic they were. He had a bunch of gods. The people that were there had a bunch of gods. He's going to send one priest back to go teach about one more god, and maybe that'll placate him, and we'll get along. Maybe there is a god in that spot, but our god's more powerful. We didn't really kill him. Okay, fine. Verse 29, nevertheless, each national group made its own gods in the several towns where they settled and set them up in the shrines the people of Samaria had made in the high places. So everybody was used to having a high place, and they saw a high place, and they just took their gods and set them up there. Verse 30, the men from Babylon made Succoth-Benoth, the men from Cutha made Nergal, the men from Hamath made Ashima, the Avites made Nibhaz and Tartak, the Sepharvites burned their children in the fire as sacrifices to Adramelech and Anamelech, the gods of Saravvaim. They worshipped the Lord, but they also appointed all sorts of their own people to officiate for them as priests in the shrines of the high places. They worshipped the Lord, but they also served their own gods in accordance with the customs of the nations from which they had been brought. So they started worshiping Yahweh also. And by the way, this is the start of the Sumerian people. We normally simplify the story. The Sumerians were half-breeds. They were half Israelite. No, they actually weren't. They were made up from all sorts of people except Israelites. No Israelites were left in the land. But they were told, basically by the king of Assyria, worship Yahweh also. Worship your gods, worship my gods. But he's the God in that place and he's not gone away, well then worship him too. With time, by the time of Jesus, and the intertestamental period, the Jews in what used to be Judah influenced them and taught them the Mosaic law and taught them, and they may have intermarried with the Jews that came back from exile, They may have intermarried some with the Jews that left when the Babylonians came in to conquer the land. But they weren't really half-breeds in the sense that we normally think of. They were a trace of Jews in them. But they came to worship the Jewish God because God was still working in that land. And they gave up the worship of all these false gods and actually did a better job of worshiping Yahweh than the Jews did. But of course, the Jews excluded them because they weren't Jewish. They shouldn't be worshiping Yahweh. They missed the point of the Babylonian captivity. Moses had said, you will be priests to the world. And they were supposed to be teaching the whole world how to worship Yahweh, not adopting all the practices of all the other nations and adopting their gods and mixing it up. And when they get a chance of people that are wanting to worship Yahweh, they say, fine, here's the law, here's what you should do, but you can't worship with us. We exclude you. You got to do it on your own. And because you don't do it with us, you're doing it wrong. They miss the point. Verse 34, to this day they persist in their own former practices. They neither worship the Lord nor adhere to the decrees and ordinances, the laws and commands that the Lord gave the descendants of Jacob, whom he named Israel. When the Lord made a covenant with the Israelites, he commanded them, do not worship any other gods or bow down to them, serve them or sacrifice to them. But the Lord, who brought you up out of Egypt with mighty power and outstretched arm, is the one you must worship. To him you shall bow down, and to him offer sacrifices. You must always be careful to keep the decrees, the ordinances, the laws, and the commands he wrote for you. Do not worship other gods. Do not forget the covenant I have made with you, and do not worship other gods. Rather, worship the Lord your God. It is he who will deliver you from the hand of all your enemies. They would not listen, however, but persisted in their former practices. Even while these people were worshiping the Lord, they served their idols. To this day, their children and grandchildren continue to do so as their fathers did. So, again, he's being prophetic. He's writing a legal injunction against these people that say they're worshiping Yahweh, even though they're not Israelites, and say, you're not doing it right. Well, they're not, but you're also excluding them, and not paying attention and not teaching them. And how can they do it right? They need to know not to worship all the other gods. Now, the Jews that come back from the Babylonian captivity, that's what they criticize about the Samaritans, and they do actually try to teach them the Mosaic law and to worship it, and they eventually give up all the idols and all the other gods. And the Samaritans were worshiping Yahweh as they knew how. And they'd had centuries rubbing shoulders with the Jews rejecting them the whole time. And both of them claiming to worship the same God. And at various times, Samaritans had come down to the second temple to worship and then been excluded. They had been, other people, the Edomites, which under the Greeks got to be known as Edominians, they started worshiping Yahweh. And so when the Romans came in and the Jews entered the Roman Empire to solve their own internal problems, the Edominians also entered the Roman Empire and says, hey, we're Jews too. They weren't. They were Edomite. And we worship their God. And in fact, Herod's dad started playing politics because he wanted his descendants to be the king of the Jews. And hence, Herod the Great claimed the title that he was the king of the Jews, and he married a Jewish woman, and he was going to be the Jewish king, and he was going to be the Jewish king over the Jews, the Edomians, and the Samaritans, all the people that worshipped Yahweh. And he was going to bring them back into one happy family where they would all worship at the temple. And that's why he spent so much money building the temple and practicing, and in public practicing Judaism. Now, he still practiced his power politics in private. That was what he really worshipped. And he had this grand vision. His father's the one that had it, and he managed to be the king, and he became the vassal king under Roman rule, but he actually acted very much like an independent king that was an ally to the Romans. And they allowed him to do that because he kept the Jews and the Samaritans and the Edomians, who were all rebellious people, under control. And they were like, if it works. And he sent people to fight help them fight their wars, and they sent people to help him fight his wars, and he helped the Roman goals, and they're like, he's a loyal guy. And you already see that developing here. The Samaritans originally did not have any Hebrew blood in them, but they were worshiping Yahweh. And because they weren't taught any better, they just worshiped Yahweh in addition to all their other gods. When you're already polytheistic, what's adding one more? He's clearly the God of this place. We lost Uncle Joe to that lion, and cousin Sam, and so we got to worship this God. He's powerful. And they did not follow the Mosaic law because they didn't know it. Because the priests they followed didn't obey the Mosaic law. And they continued to do so until this got recorded. The 2 generations later is basically about the time the Babylonians start rising. That would be when Manasseh was on the throne. So the best king of Israel was the last king of Israel. He was a terrible king. He was unjust, and he couldn't protect the country. And he still didn't worship Yahweh, right? But he at least didn't worship the golden bulls. That's a sad statement about him. Holy Father, I ask that you would purify your people in this land again, that we would turn to you in large numbers, that you would convict us, that we would humble ourselves before you, that we would pray and seek your face and turn from our wicked way, that we would study your word and live it, and that we'd be a distinct, peculiar people that can be a witness for you in this vile culture we find ourselves in. That no matter what goes on politically, we would be theologically pure and correct and not worship the other things that this culture entices us with. comforts and material things and political things and entertainment and own and own and own. And that we think we're masters of our own fate and we can do whatever we and our heart's desire pleases. But the way of man leads to destruction, and it's only your way that leads to righteousness and eternal life. Lord, I ask that you send your Holy Spirit through this land again in a great awakening, that many people will come to obedience to you, become Christians, and worship you, that you can bless this land again. But Lord, you would be righteous to destroy us like you destroyed Israel, because we as a people have known you, and then we've rejected you and we're doing our own thing and calling evil good and good evil. Lord, at least have your own people stay faithful to you, that we could be bright and shining witnesses for you in this vile culture. In your holy name, amen. I am your host, Frank Reich, Associate Pastor of Family and Ministry at Grace Fellowship Baptist Church, and this has been the Wednesday evening Bible study for Wednesday, September 18th, 2024. This is recorded on Tuesday, September 17th, 2024. This has been a rough week for me. I missed over half of the day at work yesterday. I had a 7 o'clock medical appointment and was with multiple medical people, and they did multiple things. And I have another 7 a.m. medical appointment Thursday morning where they're going to do more things. Right now I am relatively pain-free. They've done me some good, but we're far from over. There's lots of things still to go on. So please pray for me. The church is also in our own stress because of everything else that's going on, and there are people in much more stress than me. So, pray for them also, as you know the conditions. I hope to see you there tomorrow night. If not, I hope to see you Sunday. And if not, we'll see you here on YouTube. Have a blessed week.